December 17, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The morning fog hung thick between the snow-laden pines when Master Mechanic Klaus Zimmermann first saw the abandoned American Jeep. It sat at an awkward angle in a frozen ditch, olive-drab paint barely visible beneath a dusting of fresh snow, its hood still warm to the touch. The Americans had fled in such haste that they'd left the keys dangling from the ignition, a detail that brought a rare smile to Klaus's weathered face. After 3 years of keeping dying German vehicles alive with nothing but ingenuity and scavenged parts, finding an intact enemy machine felt like discovering buried treasure. Klaus was 42 years old, too old for frontline service but too valuable to waste anywhere but a repair depot. Before the war, he had worked at the Mercedes-Benz factory in Stuttgart, where precision and perfection were religion. His hands had assembled engines for some of the finest vehicles ever built. Now those same hands kept German half-tracks and trucks running long past their intended lifespans, performing mechanical miracles with equipment that should have been scrapped months ago. His small depot, hidden in a requisitioned Belgian barn 15 kilometers behind the new offensive lines, served as a critical link in the Wehrmacht's supply chain. When vehicles broke down, they came to Klaus, and lately, they came often. His assistant, 20-year-old Stefan Baumann, slid down into the ditch beside the Jeep, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. "Shall we tow it back to the depot, Herr Zimmermann?" The younger man's enthusiasm was barely contained. Like most Germans, Stefan had been raised on stories of American mechanical inferiority, of a nation that could mass-produce quantity but never quality. Capturing an intact enemy vehicle was the kind of intelligence coup that might earn commendations. Klaus circled the Jeep slowly, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. It was smaller than he'd expected, almost comically simple in its construction. The body panels looked stamped rather than carefully formed. The welds were functional but lacked the meticulous craftsmanship he'd been trained to admire. Everything about it seemed rushed, unrefined, built to a price rather than a standard. Yet here it sat, apparently undamaged, in conditions that had already claimed 2 of their own Kübelwagens that morning. "Yes," Klaus finally said, running his gloved hand along the hood, "get the recovery truck. I want to see what makes this thing work." He didn't add what he was really thinking, that he needed to understand how the Americans could abandon vehicles like this so casually, while German mechanics fought desperately to keep every machine running. Something about that casual abandonment troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The fog was lifting as they chained the Jeep for towing. Through the clearing mist, Klaus could see black smoke rising from burning vehicles along the road where American convoys had been caught by the surprise offensive. The Germans were winning again, pushing back their enemies with the kind of decisive action that felt like the early war years. But Klaus had been a mechanic too long to trust surface appearances. He knew that what mattered wasn't just how well something worked when new, but how long it could keep working when everything went wrong. The barn that housed Klaus's repair depot had once stored hay and farm equipment. Now it smelled of oil, metal shavings, and the acrid tang of welding torches. 3 German trucks in various states of disrepair occupied most of the space, their engines scattered across workbenches in organized chaos. When Stefan backed the recovery truck through the wide doors, towing the captured Jeep behind it, every mechanic in the depot stopped working to stare. "Look at this thing," laughed Corporal Heinrich Müller, wiping grease from his hands onto his already filthy coveralls. Heinrich was 35, a former machinist from Hamburg who had lost 2 fingers to a lathe accident in 1942. The injury had saved him from the Eastern Front. The Americans build toys and call them military vehicles. Klaus said nothing as they positioned the Jeep in the center of the workspace, under the best lighting. He walked around it again, this time more slowly, taking notes in the small leather journal he always carried. The vehicle's dimensions, the tire specifications, the way the body panels were attached. Everything was simpler than German equivalents, almost primitive in its directness. There were no elegant solutions here, no clever engineering that made you appreciate the designer's brilliance, just metal and function. Stefan pulled a toolbox closer, eager to begin. "Should we start with the engine, Herr Zimmermann? See what kind of power plant the Americans are using?" The young man's technical education had been accelerated by the war, compressed into months what should have taken years. He was skilled but lacked the deep understanding that came only from experience. Klaus envied his enthusiasm even as he worried about his naivety. "First, we document everything," Klaus said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher. "Photographs, measurements, detailed notes. If this vehicle has intelligence value, we need to preserve that information before we disturb anything." He had already decided this examination would be thorough, methodical, scientific. Something about the Jeep had captured his professional curiosity in a way that surprised him. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of working on something that wasn't broken for once. The other mechanics returned to their own projects, but Klaus noticed them glancing over periodically, curiosity overcoming their initial dismissiveness. Heinrich brought over a camera, and they spent the next hour documenting the Jeep from every angle. Stefan sketched diagrams in his own notebook, copying the technique he'd learned from Klaus. The work was meticulous and calming, a reminder that even in wartime, proper procedure mattered. As afternoon light slanted through gaps in the barn walls, Klaus finally allowed Stefan to open the hood. The engine that greeted them was shockingly simple. 4 cylinders, basic carburetor, nothing exotic or impressive. It looked like something a competent apprentice could build in a well-equipped garage. Heinrich, who had wandered over to look, actually laughed out loud. "This is what we're fighting?" he said, shaking his head. "They send farmers to war in farm equipment." But Klaus wasn't laughing. He was counting bolts, noting how few there were, observing how everything seemed designed for quick access, easy maintenance, simple replacement. His engineering mind was beginning to recognize something, though he couldn't quite articulate it yet. Something about the Jeep's very crudeness was starting to whisper an uncomfortable truth. The systematic disassembly began the following morning. Klaus had decided to treat the Jeep like a puzzle, removing each component with surgical precision, labeling everything, arranging the parts in careful groupings on canvas tarps spread across the barn floor. Stefan worked beside him, learning to see vehicles the way Klaus did, as collections of solved problems rather than mysterious machines. They started with the body panels. In German vehicles, removing such components often required specialized tools, careful attention to avoid damaging precisely fitted parts, and significant time. The Jeep's panels came off with standard wrenches in minutes. Every bolt was the same size. Every bracket was stamped from flat steel rather than cast or machined into complex shapes. It was almost insulting how simple it all was. "Look at this," Stefan said, holding up a door hinge. "A child could have made this. There's no artistry here, no craft." He was right, of course. The hinge was purely functional, stamped from sheet metal, designed only to work rather than to impress. Klaus set it carefully on the growing collection of hardware, each piece tagged with paper labels written in his neat handwriting. By midday, they had exposed the Jeep's frame and suspension. Here, Klaus began to see patterns that troubled his assumptions. The frame rails were simple channel steel, nothing exotic, but they were designed with an understanding of stress distribution that showed sophisticated engineering thinking. The suspension was crude by German standards, with leaf springs that would have been rejected by Mercedes as peasant technology. Yet everything was robust, overbuilt for the loads it would face, designed to survive abuse rather than provide refinement. "Herr Zimmermann," Stefan called from the rear axle. "This differential is so simple I could rebuild it blindfolded." The young man was pulling the cover off, revealing gears that were neither particularly precise nor particularly elegant. Klaus came to look, his trained eye immediately recognizing what Stefan had missed. The gears were indeed simple, but they were also generous in their tolerances. They would be noisy, inefficient by German standards, but they would keep working even when worn, even when contaminated with dirt, even when maintenance was delayed. Klaus returned to the engine, now fully exposed on the workbench. He had rebuilt hundreds of engines in his career, from delicate motorcycle mills to massive truck diesels. This 4-cylinder unit was unremarkable in almost every way except one. Every component was accessible. The spark plugs could be changed in 2 minutes. The carburetor could be removed with 3 bolts. The oil filter was right on top where even an idiot could find it. German engines were masterpieces of compact engineering, but servicing them often required removing half the vehicle first. Heinrich wandered over during his break, coffee cup in hand, looking at the disassembled Jeep spread across the floor like an anatomy lesson. "Still think it's worth studying?" he asked. "Looks like they just threw random parts together and hoped for the best." Klaus didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the pile of identical bolts he'd removed, realizing that every single one was the same thread pitch and size. That couldn't be accidental. That was a choice, a philosophy, a completely different way of thinking about how machines should work. That evening, after the other mechanics had retired to their quarters in the farmhouse, Klaus remained in the barn with the disassembled Jeep. A kerosene lantern cast dancing shadows across the organized chaos of parts. He sat on a wooden stool, his journal open on his lap, trying to articulate the realization that had been growing all day. "German engineering," he wrote, "seeks perfection in each component. American engineering seeks adequacy in the whole system." It was a simple observation, but its implications were profound. Everything he had been trained to value, precision, craftsmanship, technical sophistication, was absent from this vehicle. Yet the absence was deliberate, not accidental. Someone had chosen simplicity over complexity, standardization over optimization, repairability over performance. Klaus thought about the Kübelwagen, Germany's equivalent light vehicle. It was superior to the Jeep in almost every measurable way. Better handling, more sophisticated suspension, cleverer engineering solutions. He had worked on dozens of them, admired their ingenuity, the way they did more with less. But he had also watched them fail in the field, had seen mechanics struggle to repair them without proper tools or replacement parts, had witnessed vehicles abandoned because a single specialized component had broken and no replacement existed within 500 kilometers. The barn door creaked open. Stefan entered, carrying 2 tin cups of ersatz coffee. "Couldn't sleep, Herr Zimmermann?" The young man handed Klaus a cup and sat on an oil drum, looking at the disassembled vehicle. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about the bolts all being the same size." Klaus sipped the bitter coffee. "And? It means any soldier could work on it," Stefan said slowly. "You wouldn't need a master mechanic. You wouldn't even need a complete toolkit, just a few basic wrenches and some common sense." The realization was dawning on him, the same uncomfortable recognition Klaus had been wrestling with all day. "Exactly," Klaus said. "This Jeep isn't designed to be the best vehicle. It's designed to be the vehicle that keeps working when everything else has failed. When the depots are overrun, when the supply lines are cut, when all you have is a farm boy with a wrench and whatever parts he can scavenge from other broken Jeeps." Stefan was quiet for a moment. "But we build better vehicles. The Kübelwagen is superior in every way." "Is it?" Klaus asked. "We've lost 3 Kübelwagens this month to broken transmission gears. Each time, the vehicle had to be abandoned because we don't have replacement transmissions. We can't manufacture them fast enough, can't deliver them to the field, can't keep vehicles running." He gestured at the Jeep parts. "But this? Every part is interchangeable with every other Jeep. Break something, you pull a replacement from any damaged vehicle you find. No precision fitting required, no specialized knowledge needed." The lantern flickered as a cold draft swept through the barn. Outside, they could hear distant artillery, a reminder that the war was never far away. Stefan stared at the Jeep's simple engine, and Klaus could see the young man's worldview beginning to shift, the same way his own had shifted throughout this long, revealing day. The comparison was inevitable. Klaus decided it needed to be systematic, scientific, documented. The next morning, he ordered Heinrich to bring one of their functioning Kübelwagens into the barn and park it beside the partially reassembled Jeep. Stefan helped him create a chart on a large piece of butcher paper pinned to the barn wall, listing categories for comparison. The Kübelwagen was beautiful in its way. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself, it represented the pinnacle of German automotive thinking. Its air-cooled engine was a masterpiece of compact engineering, tucked neatly at the rear. The body was light, aerodynamic, formed from compound curves that required skilled craftsmen to produce. Every part had been optimized, refined, perfected. Klaus had always felt pride working on them, appreciation for the brilliant minds that had created such an elegant machine. "Wait," Klaus called out. Stefan climbed onto a scale with various parts, doing the arithmetic. The Jeep was heavier, built with thicker steel, more robust components. In peacetime, engineers would call that inefficient, wasteful, but Klaus was beginning to understand that in war, weight meant durability, meant surviving one more impact, one more rough road, one more day, maintenance intervals. Klaus continued. The Kübelwagen required oil changes every 2,000 kilometers, valve adjustments every 3,000, careful attention to its sophisticated reduction gear system. The Jeep's manual, which they had found in the glove box, recommended service intervals twice as long, and the procedures were simple enough that the manual included cartoon illustrations for soldiers who could barely read. Heinrich joined them, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've been counting the unique parts," he said, his tone less mocking than it had been 2 days ago. "The Kübelwagen has over 200 distinct components in the drivetrain alone. Custom gears, specially machined housings, precision bearings." He paused, looking at his notes. "The Jeep has maybe 70. Everything else is duplicated or standardized." Klaus added this to the chart. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Stefan voiced what they were all thinking. "Herr Zimmermann, how many factories can build Kübelwagen components? How many machinists have the skills to produce precision reduction gears?" "Dozens of factories," Klaus said quietly. "Perhaps 100 truly skilled workers." He looked at the Jeep. "But this? Any factory with metal presses and basic machine tools could produce these parts. Any machinist with 6 months training could maintain quality control. Any assembly line worker could put them together." The morning sun broke through the barn's eastern windows, illuminating the two vehicles in harsh light. The Kübelwagen gleamed, its careful curves and precise panel gaps a testament to German craftsmanship. The Jeep sat blockier, cruder, unashamed of its industrial simplicity. Klaus thought about the endless American factories he had heard about, the production capacity that supposedly dwarfed Germany's, despite their smaller population of skilled workers. "They're not trying to build better vehicles," Klaus said, finally understanding. "They're building vehicles they can produce faster than we can destroy them. Vehicles so simple that anyone can fix them, anywhere, with anything." He looked at his colleagues. "They've industrialized war itself." The barn fell silent, except for the distant sound of artillery growing closer each day. Stefan couldn't stop thinking about the chart. That evening, he found Klaus in the small office they'd set up in the farmhouse's former parlor, a cramped space filled with requisition forms and repair logs. The young man closed the door behind him, something he'd never done before. The gesture signaled that this conversation needed privacy. "Herr Zimmermann, may I speak freely?" Stefan's voice was hesitant, careful. In the Wehrmacht, even mechanics had to watch their words. Defeatist talk could earn a court-martial, and Klaus knew that questioning German superiority, even in engineering terms, could be dangerous. "Sit," Klaus said, gesturing to the only other chair. He closed his own logbook, giving Stefan his full attention. The young man looked troubled, the kind of trouble that came from seeing past comfortable lies into uncomfortable truth. "If the Americans can build 10 Jeeps in the time it takes us to build one Kübelwagen," Stefan began slowly, "and if those Jeeps are easier to maintain, easier to repair, easier to keep running." He trailed off, unwilling or unable to complete the thought. Klaus finished it for him. "Then they can overwhelm us through sheer numbers, even if each individual vehicle is inferior." He had been thinking the same thing for 2 days now, the mathematics becoming inescapable. "Yes, Stefan, that's exactly what it means." The young man leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "They told us in training that American industry was inefficient, that they built cheap rubbish, that one German soldier was worth 10 Americans because of our superior equipment and training." His voice cracked slightly. But if their equipment is designed to be produced in quantities we can't match, then superior quality becomes irrelevant, Klaus said. He felt a weight settling on his chest, the burden of understanding something he couldn't unlearn. I've been doing calculations. Conservative estimates suggest America is producing vehicles at 50 times our rate. Even if half of them break down, even if 3/4 break down, they'll still have more functional vehicles in the field than we do. Stefan looked up, his young face aged by realization. Is that why we're always short of everything? Spare parts, fuel, ammunition? Not because of incompetence, but because we simply can't produce enough? Klaus nodded slowly. We're fighting an industrial war with artisan methods. Every tank, every vehicle, every weapon system we build is a masterpiece of engineering. But masterpieces take time, require skilled labor, need specialized components. He gestured toward the barn, where the Jeep sat. They're building adequate tools in overwhelming numbers. And in war, adequate tools in abundance defeat perfect tools in scarcity. The room fell quiet. Outside, they could hear Heinrich and the other mechanics playing cards, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the dark conversation happening in the office. Stefan finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known that we might not win? Klaus considered lying, offering false hope, but respected the young man too much for that. I've had doubts since Stalingrad. But this Jeep? He paused. This Jeep made those doubts into certainties. They've solved a problem we didn't even know existed. And now it may be too late for us to learn the lesson. December 23, 1944. The German offensive that had begun with such promise was faltering. Klaus could track the war's progress not through official reports, which remained optimistically vague, but through the desperate requisitions flooding his depot. More vehicles needed repair. Fewer spare parts arrived. The mathematics of attrition were playing out exactly as the Jeep had predicted. The barn had become a graveyard of broken German machinery. 2 half-tracks sat with cracked engine blocks, victims of a brutally cold night when antifreeze supplies hadn't arrived. A Kubelwagen awaited a replacement transmission that would never come. 3 trucks needed tires that didn't exist in any depot within 200 kilometers. Klaus and his team performed mechanical triage daily, deciding which vehicles might be salvaged and which had to be abandoned. The captured Jeep, fully reassembled now, sat in the corner like a silent witness. Klaus had signed papers claiming it as a study vehicle, protecting it from being requisitioned by desperate field commanders. He told himself this was for intelligence purposes, but truthfully, he had grown oddly protective of the machine. It represented something he was still trying to understand, a truth that felt important even as his world collapsed around him. Snow fell heavily on Christmas Eve morning. Heinrich stumbled into the barn, his face grim. The supply convoy from Bonn is 3 days overdue. Command says we should assume it's been destroyed or captured. He didn't need to explain what this meant. Without that convoy, they had fuel for perhaps 5 more days, spare parts for critical repairs that could be counted on one hand, and food stores that would last a week if they rationed carefully. Stefan was under a truck, trying to fabricate a replacement fuel pump from parts scavenged from 2 other broken pumps. It was the kind of improvised repair that Klaus had become expert at, mechanical witchcraft that kept dying machines alive for just a few more days. The young man emerged, covered in grease, holding up a cobbled-together assembly that might work if they were lucky, if God smiled on them. That's brilliant work, Klaus said, and meant it. Stefan had learned well, had become the kind of mechanic who could create something from nothing. But even as he praised the young man's skill, Klaus felt a deep sadness. All this talent, all this desperate cleverness, was being spent trying to overcome a fundamental problem that couldn't be solved by individual brilliance. They were artisans trying to compete with assembly lines. That afternoon, a dispatch rider arrived on a struggling motorcycle, bringing new orders. A critical ammunition convoy had broken down 40 kilometers east. 3 trucks dead, blocking a vital supply route. Every available vehicle and mechanic was to report immediately for recovery operations. Klaus read the order twice, then looked around his barn at the broken machinery, the exhausted men, the dwindling supplies. "Get the Jeep ready," he told Stefan quietly. Heinrich stared at him. "The American vehicle? Are you serious?" Klaus met his gaze. "It's the only thing we have that I'm certain will start, will run, and will get us there and back. Do you have a better suggestion?" The silence that followed was answer enough. The decision felt like betrayal, though Klaus couldn't articulate who exactly he was betraying. Using an enemy vehicle to support German operations violated some unspoken principle, an admission that their own machines had failed them. But principles didn't matter when soldiers were freezing on a roadside, waiting for help that might never arrive if it depended on German vehicles alone. Stefan filled the Jeep's tank from their dwindling fuel supplies, while Klaus gathered tools and recovery equipment. Heinrich stood watching, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "If anyone asks," he finally said, "I'll tell them we had no choice." It wasn't quite approval, but it wasn't condemnation either, just a pragmatic acceptance of their desperate circumstances. The Jeep started on the first turn of the key. The engine's rough idle, which would have embarrassed any German manufacturer, suddenly sounded like a promise of reliability. Klaus took the driver's seat, Stefan beside him, recovery chains rattling in the back. They had painted rough German crosses on the hood to avoid being shot by their own side, a precaution that felt both necessary and absurd. The road east was a nightmare of ice and snow. Abandoned vehicles lined the route, some German, some American, all casualties of winter and war. The Jeep plowed through conditions that would have stopped more refined vehicles, its simple four-wheel drive system and high ground clearance making obstacles merely difficult rather than impossible. Klaus found himself developing a grudging respect for the machine's unpretentious competence. They found the convoy exactly where the dispatch had indicated. 3 5-ton trucks sat at awkward angles across the narrow road, engines cold, drivers huddled in makeshift shelters trying to stay warm. The senior sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Fischer, approached the Jeep with visible confusion. "Where's the recovery vehicle?" he demanded, then noticed the American markings barely hidden under German crosses. His expression shifted through surprise, understanding, and finally a bitter laugh. "It's come to this, has it? We need American machines to save German soldiers." Klaus climbed out, already assessing the situation. 2 trucks had mechanical failures, one had simply run out of fuel. Standard problems with standard solutions, except they had no spare parts and limited fuel to share. "We can tow 1 truck at a time, back to the depot," he said. "Fix what we can, scavenge parts from the one that's worst off." They worked through the afternoon, the Jeep proving its worth with each task. It pulled a 5-ton truck through deep snow without complaint. Its simple electrical system provided power for welding equipment when they attempted field repairs. When one soldier commented that the American vehicle seemed more reliable than their own, Fischer silenced him with a look, but didn't contradict the observation. As twilight fell, they had managed to recover 2 trucks and cannibalize the 3rd. The convoy could move again, slowly, carefully, but move. Stefan sat in the Jeep's passenger seat, exhausted, watching Klaus guide them back toward the depot through gathering darkness. "We wouldn't have managed this with a Kübelwagen," Stefan said quietly. Klaus didn't respond, but they both knew it was true. The simple American machine had accomplished what German engineering excellence could not. The lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. Over the next 5 days, the Jeep became indispensable. Klaus found himself requisitioning it for tasks that should have gone to German vehicles, justifying each decision with pragmatic necessity. When a medical transport broke down carrying wounded soldiers, the Jeep made the run. When reconnaissance needed a vehicle that could navigate forest tracks, the Jeep went. When desperate supply runs required something absolutely reliable, Klaus reached for the American keys without hesitation. The machine never failed. It ran in temperatures that froze German vehicles solid. Its simple engine started reliably, while more sophisticated motors refused to turn over. The standardized parts meant Stefan could perform maintenance quickly, without waiting for specialized components that never arrived. Every mission completed, every task accomplished, was another data point in Klaus's growing understanding of what industrial war truly meant. Heinrich noticed the pattern. On New Year's morning, he confronted Klaus in the barn, his voice tight with frustration. "We're using that American machine more than our own vehicles now. Do you realize how that looks? What it says about us?" Klaus was checking the Jeep's oil, a routine that took 30 seconds compared to the 20-minute process required for a Kübelwagen's engine. "It says, we're pragmatic enough to use the best tool for the job, regardless of where it came from. It says we've failed," Heinrich shot back, "that everything we believed about German engineering superiority was a lie." His voice cracked slightly. Klaus understood that this wasn't really about vehicles. Heinrich was watching his worldview crumble. The certainties he'd built his identity on, revealing themselves as comfortable fictions. Klaus set down the dipstick, wiping his hands slowly. "Not a lie, Heinrich, just incomplete. We built better individual machines, but they built a better system for producing and maintaining machines in wartime. Both things can be true." Stefan appeared in the doorway, snowflakes dusting his shoulders. "Herr Zimmermann, dispatch just came through. They need the Jeep again. Bridge repair team needs equipment transported through the forest where the roads are impassable." He paused, seeing the tension between the two older men. "Should I tell them we can't do it?" Klaus looked at Heinrich, waiting. The Hamburg machinist stared at the Jeep for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally he shook his head. "No, send the Jeep, it'll get through." He turned to Klaus. "I'm not arguing that we shouldn't use it. I'm saying we should have been smart enough to build something like this ourselves. We were too proud of our cleverness to see the wisdom in simplicity." That afternoon, Klaus drove the bridge repair mission personally. The forest tracks were barely paths, narrow passages between ancient trees where snow had drifted waist-deep in places. The Jeep pushed through conditions that would have been suicide for most vehicles, its narrow wheelbase and high clearance designed exactly for such terrain. Klaus thought about the engineers who had created this machine, wondered if they had known their simple, crude vehicle would prove superior to more sophisticated designs, or if they'd simply stumbled onto the right answer by accident. Either way, the result was the same. January 3, 1945. Klaus sat at the small desk in his quarters, a single candle providing light as he conserved the depot's dwindling fuel supplies. Before him lay 2 sheets of precious paper and the fountain pen his wife had given him before the war. Writing letters had become increasingly difficult, not because he lacked things to say, but because saying them honestly felt dangerous. His brother Ernst was an engineer with a panzer division somewhere on the Eastern Front. They had always shared a passion for mechanical things, had spent childhood afternoons taking apart clocks and bicycles, trying to understand how the world worked. Ernst's last letter had been optimistic, praising the superiority of German tank design, confident that quality would ultimately triumph over Soviet quantity. Klaus needed to tell him the truth, but doing so required careful language that might slip past military censors. "Dear Ernst," he began, "I hope this letter finds you well and that your tigers are serving you reliably. I write to you about an interesting engineering problem I have encountered recently. We captured an American utility vehicle, and I have spent considerable time studying its design philosophy." Klaus paused, considering his words. The censors would read this, looking for defeatism, for anything that might harm morale. He had to be subtle, had to trust that Ernst would understand the implications of what he was carefully not saying directly. "The American machine is crude by our standards," he continued. "Simple components, loose tolerances, nothing that would earn praise from our professors at the technical university. Yet it runs reliably in conditions that have defeated more sophisticated vehicles. I have concluded that the Americans have optimized for different objectives than we have. Where we seek mechanical excellence, they seek operational persistence. Where we design for performance, they design for production volume and field maintenance." He thought about the Jeep sitting in the barn below, about the dozen missions it had completed while German vehicles sat broken and waiting for parts, about Heinrich's bitter observation that they had been too proud to see wisdom in simplicity. "I wonder, Ernst, if we have been answering the wrong question. We have created masterpieces when perhaps the war required us to create adequate tools in overwhelming numbers. There is a mathematics to industrial conflict that transcends individual engineering brilliance. I fear we understood this too late, if we understand it at all. Klaus set down his pen, reading what he had written. It was as close to heresy as he dared commit to paper. A gentle suggestion that German superiority might be a comforting myth rather than objective reality. Ernst would understand. Ernst had always been the quicker mind, the one who could extrapolate from hints and see larger patterns. He added a final paragraph about family matters, about hoping they would both survive to see their children again, about the small normalcies that felt increasingly like dreams from another life. Then he sealed the letter, addressed it carefully, and set it aside for the morning post. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance. The Americans were coming closer. Klaus thought about the thousands of jeeps they would bring with them, the endless stream of adequate vehicles that would simply outlast anything Germany could field. He blew out the candle and sat in darkness, thinking about letters, about brothers, about truths too dangerous to speak aloud. January 15, 1945. The orders came at dawn, terse and unmistakable. All repair depots within 50 kilometers of the front were to evacuate immediately. Allied forces had broken through German lines and were advancing rapidly. Non-essential equipment was to be destroyed. Essential vehicles were to be driven west toward new defensive positions. Everything else was to be abandoned. Klaus read the dispatch 3 times, each reading making the situation clearer and more desperate. His depot had 7 vehicles in various states of repair. 2 might be drivable with immediate work. 3 were missing critical components that would never arrive. The remaining 2 were little more than parts donors, stripped to keep other machines running. The mathematics were brutal and simple. They couldn't save everything, couldn't even save most things. Heinrich and Stefan stood waiting, their faces reflecting the same grim calculation Klaus was performing. "How long do we have?" Heinrich asked. 12 hours, Klaus said. "Maybe less if the Americans move faster than expected." He walked through the barn, looking at machines he had kept alive through skill and improvisation, vehicles that represented hundreds of hours of desperate labor. All of it would be abandoned, left for the enemy, or destroyed to prevent capture. Stefan pointed at the Kübelwagen they'd been repairing. "I can get that transmission installed in 6 hours if we work. Straight through. Then we'd have 3 vehicles to evacuate." Klaus shook his head. "Even if we install the transmission, it needs testing, adjustment. We'd be gambling that it holds together for 200 kilometers of winter roads." He looked around the barn at the accumulation of parts, tools, equipment they'd collected over months. "We take what we can carry in 2 vehicles. Destroy the rest." The decision of which vehicles to take was obvious, though no one wanted to say it first. Finally, Heinrich spoke, his voice flat. "The Jeep and the best truck. Those are the only ones we can trust to actually get us there." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After all their work keeping German vehicles running, after all their skill and determination, they would flee in an American machine because it was the only thing they could rely on. Klaus felt the symbolism like a weight on his chest. This was how empires fell. Not in glorious battles but in small, practical defeats, in mechanics choosing enemy vehicles over their own, because survival demanded pragmatism over pride. They spent the morning loading the truck and jeep with tools, parts, and personal belongings. The afternoon was devoted to destruction. Engines were broken with sledgehammers. Fuel tanks were drained. Anything that might be useful to the enemy was methodically ruined. Klaus supervised the demolition, each blow of the hammer feeling like a personal failure. By late afternoon, the barn that had been their workshop stood empty except for wreckage. Stefan stared at the destruction, his young face hollow. "All that work," he said quietly, "all those repairs, all those hours, for nothing." "Not for nothing," Klaus replied. "We learned something important. We learned why we're losing." He climbed into the jeep, turned the key, and the simple engine started immediately, ready to carry them west toward an uncertain future. The convoy formed in the frozen twilight. Klaus driving the jeep with Stefan beside him, Heinrich following in the overloaded truck with 2 other mechanics. They joined a stream of retreating German forces, a ragged procession of defeat moving west on icy roads. The contrast between their situation and the confident advance of 2 months earlier was absolute. The jeep performed flawlessly, exactly as Klaus had known it would. While German vehicles around them broke down, overheated despite the cold, or simply stopped working for mysterious reasons, the American machine maintained its steady pace. Its simple engine ran smoothly. Its robust drivetrain handled the terrible roads without complaint. Every kilometer they traveled felt like vindication of everything Klaus had learned from studying the vehicle. Around midnight, they passed an abandoned German column. 5 vehicles sat frozen and dead, their crews long since fled on foot or hitched rides with other units. Stefan stared at them as they drove past. "Those are all newer than our truck," he observed. "Better manufactured, better maintained. Why are they dead while we're still moving?" Klaus didn't answer immediately. The answer was complex, involving supply chains and spare parts and design philosophies, but it was also brutally simple. Because they were designed for peacetime conditions and perfect maintenance. This war stopped being perfect a long time ago. They drove through the night, stopping only for fuel and brief rests. Heinrich's truck struggled but kept pace, its engine running roughly but persistently. By dawn, they had covered 80 kilometers, putting distance between themselves and the advancing Americans. But the roads were becoming more congested with refugees and retreating soldiers, the infrastructure of defeat. Near noon, disaster struck. Heinrich's truck threw a rod, the engine seizing with a grinding shriek that spoke of catastrophic failure. They pulled to the roadside, Klaus already knowing the diagnosis before he opened the hood. The damage was terminal, unfixable, without a complete engine replacement. The truck was dead. 5 mechanics stood in the snow, looking at their supplies and equipment piled in the truck bed. There was no way to fit everything in the jeep. They would have to choose what to save and what to abandon. Klaus made the decisions quickly, prioritizing personal items and small, valuable tools. The heavier equipment, the spare parts, the accumulated material they'd salvaged, all of it would stay behind. "Everyone in the jeep," Klaus ordered. 5 men in a vehicle designed for 4. They squeezed in, packing themselves like cargo, bags and boxes, filling every available space. The jeep sagged on its suspension, overloaded beyond any reasonable specification. Klaus turned the key, half expecting the engine to refuse this excessive demand. It started without hesitation. The overloaded jeep pulled back onto the road, laboring but moving. Heinrich sat crammed in the back, his face bitter. "Saved by American engineering," he muttered, after spending 3 years telling everyone German machines were superior. "German machines are superior," Klaus replied, steering around a crater, "in a different kind of war. But we're fighting this war, not that one." The jeep ground steadily westward, carrying them toward whatever came next, a small testament to the power of simple, persistent adequacy over sophisticated excellence. January 18, 1945. The end came not with drama but with exhaustion. Klaus and his crew had been driving for 3 days, stopping only when the jeep needed fuel they increasingly couldn't find. They were somewhere in eastern Belgium, the exact location uncertain, navigating by instinct through a landscape transformed by war into something unrecognizable. The American patrol appeared suddenly, emerging from morning fog like ghosts materializing into solidity. 4 jeeps, identical to the one Klaus drove, blocking the narrow road. Soldiers with rifles raised, shouting commands in English. Klaus understood enough to know they were ordering him to stop, to raise his hands, to surrender. He felt a strange calm as he turned off the engine. After months of struggling, of improvising, of watching everything collapse despite their best efforts, there was relief in simply stopping. He raised his hands slowly, making no sudden movements. Beside him, Stefan did the same, his face pale but composed. In the back, Heinrich and the others were already climbing out, hands visible, postures submissive. An American lieutenant approached, young and alert, his weapon ready but not aggressively pointed. He looked at the Jeep with obvious confusion, seeing the German markings painted over American olive drab, seeing German soldiers in an American vehicle. "What the hell is this?" he said in English. Klaus responded in his careful, accented English, words he'd been practicing since they captured the Jeep weeks earlier. "We are mechanics, Wehrmacht Repair Depot. This vehicle, we captured it. We studied it. Then we used it to escape." The lieutenant's expression shifted from suspicion to something like amazement. He walked around the Jeep, noting its condition despite obvious hard use, seeing the hasty German crosses painted over American stars. "You've been driving one of our Jeeps?" He laughed, a sound without mockery, just genuine surprise. "How'd that work out for you?" Klaus met his eyes. "It never failed. Not once. It brought us here." The admission felt like betraying something, though he couldn't articulate what. Perhaps just the final surrender of pride, the acknowledgement that the enemy had built something his side could not match. The Americans searched them efficiently but not roughly, confiscating weapons they didn't have, checking for documents and intelligence. They were processed quickly, added to a growing column of prisoners being marched toward a collection point. Klaus looked back once at the Jeep, sitting beside the road where they'd left it, keys still in the ignition. An American sergeant was already climbing into it, starting the engine, driving it away to rejoin the American motor pool from which it had been briefly separated. The Jeep would continue serving, would complete more missions, would outlast the war itself probably. It had outlasted Klaus's war, certainly. The simple machine that had taught him uncomfortable truths would go on working long after the mechanics who had studied it so carefully were forgotten. Stefan walked beside Klaus in the column of prisoners, both men silent, processing their new reality. They were captives now, their war over. The Jeep that had saved them would serve new masters, and somewhere in that transaction was a lesson about adaptability, about survival, about which philosophies endured when everything else failed. 3 days later, Klaus sat in a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse across a table from Captain Robert Mitchell, U.S. Army Intelligence. The American was perhaps 35, with the sharp eyes of someone trained to extract information from details others missed. A translator sat beside him, though Klaus had indicated he could manage in English. Between them lay Klaus's leather journal, the one he'd used to document his study of the Jeep. "This is remarkable work," Mitchell said, flipping through the pages of technical drawings, measurements, and observations. "Most captured enemy mechanics just tell us our equipment is garbage. You actually analyzed it like an engineer." He looked up, genuinely curious. "Why?" Klaus considered how to answer. "Because it was better than what we had, and I needed to understand why. Not better in the way Germans measure things, but better in ways that matter more for this kind of war." Mitchell leaned back, intrigued. "Explain that." For the next hour, Klaus walked the American intelligence officer through his conclusions. He explained the philosophy of standardization, how interchangeable parts meant field repairs without specialists. He described the advantage of simple designs that could be produced in enormous quantities by semi-skilled workers. He compared German precision engineering to American pragmatic adequacy, showing how the latter was superior in conditions of industrial warfare. "We built vehicles like art," Klaus said, searching for the right words in English. "Beautiful, sophisticated, impressive. You built vehicles like tools, simple, reliable, replaceable. When the art breaks, you need an artist to fix it. When a tool breaks, anyone with basic skills can fix it, or just get another tool." Mitchell was taking notes now, his expression thoughtful. "Did your superiors understand this? Did they know why they were losing the production war?" Klaus shook his head. "Some maybe understood, but understanding doesn't help when your entire industrial system is built wrong for the kind of war you're fighting. You can't transform factories designed for precision work into mass production facilities overnight. You can't retrain craftsmen to accept loose tolerances and good enough solutions. The whole philosophy has to change, and philosophy changes slowly." "How long have you known Germany would lose?" Mitchell asked quietly. "Known? When I saw what was left of Hamburg after your bombers came." "Suspected?" "Earlier. but the Jeep made it certain. Klaus gestured at his journal. That vehicle showed me that America had solved problems we didn't even know existed. You industrialized war itself. You turned military equipment into consumer goods, produced at consumer good scales. Germany was still fighting a craftsman's war. We never had a chance, not really. We just didn't know it yet. Mitchell closed the journal carefully. You know this will be studied? Your analysis could influence how we think about military production, about what matters in equipment design. Klaus felt tired suddenly, the exhaustion of weeks catching up. Good. Maybe the next war, people will be smarter. Build the right things instead of the impressive things. He paused. Though maybe better would be no next war at all. The American captain smiled sadly. That would be best. But I wouldn't bet on it. Camp Hearn, Texas. June 1945. Klaus had been a prisoner of war for 5 months, transported across an ocean to a compound in the heart of America. The journey itself had been revelatory, watching from a transport ship as the unscathed American coastline came into view. Cities blazing with lights that Germany hadn't seen in years. Infrastructure untouched by war's destruction. The camp held 3,000 German prisoners on land that had been cotton fields before the war. The conditions were not harsh by any reasonable measure. Adequate food, medical care, shelter from the brutal Texas heat. The Geneva Convention was followed meticulously, but it was the casual abundance that struck Klaus most forcefully. The everyday proof of everything the Jeep had suggested about American industrial capacity. Stefan worked beside him in the camp workshop where prisoners repaired equipment for local farms, a small allowance of useful labor within the restrictions of captivity. The young man had matured considerably, his pre-war certainties replaced by harder-won understanding. Herr Zimmermann, he said, setting down a wrench. Have you noticed the vehicles the guards drive? Every single one is identical to every other one of its type. Klaus had noticed. The standardization visible in the Jeep extended through the entire American military machine. Every truck the same, every tool kit identical, every spare part interchangeable. It wasn't just a philosophy applied to one vehicle. It was a comprehensive system of thinking about how machines should work in an industrial society. Heinrich had been assigned to a different work detail, but they saw each other during meals. The former machinist from Hamburg seemed diminished, as if losing the war had taken something essential from. One evening, sitting in the mess hall, he voiced what many prisoners thought but few said aloud. We were fools, Heinrich said quietly, staring at his plate of food that would have been luxurious in wartime Germany. All that talk of German superiority, of our advanced technology and superior culture. Meanwhile, they were building a machine we couldn't compete with. Not a military machine, an industrial machine. And we never even understood what we were fighting against. Klaus thought about his journal. Now somewhere in American intelligence files, his careful documentation of insights that had come too late. We understood engineering but not economics. We knew how to build excellent things but not how to build enough things. The Americans understood that in total war, enough matters more than excellent. Through the camp fence, Klaus could see the Texas landscape stretching endlessly, farmland and small towns connected by roads where traffic moved freely, powered by fuel that seemed limitless. No bombers overhead, no cities in ruins, no infrastructure destroyed. America had fought a global war and emerged not just victorious but strengthened, its industrial capacity expanded rather than depleted. What happens to us now? Stefan asked one afternoon as they worked on repairing a tractor engine, using tools and parts provided without complaint by their captors. Klaus wiped his hands on a rag, considering the question carefully. We learn, we watch, we understand how they did this, so maybe someday Germany can rebuild using these lessons. He looked at the young mechanic. The war taught us what doesn't work. Now we get to see what does. 1973. Stuttgart, West Germany. Klaus Zimmermann stood in a modern factory, watching robotic arms assemble automobile components with inhuman precision. He was 71 years old now, retired from a long career rebuilding Germany's automotive industry after the war. He had been invited to speak to a group, of engineering students about the evolution of German manufacturing philosophy. The factory floor hummed with the efficiency that had made German cars famous worldwide again. But this efficiency was different from the pre-war obsession with craftsmanship. It combined German precision with American lessons about standardization, mass production, and pragmatic design. The synthesis had taken decades to achieve, but it worked. Germany was prosperous again, competitive again, respected again. A young professor approached, curious about the old mechanic who had specifically requested to see the parts standardization systems. "Herr Zimmermann, the students are ready for your lecture. They're eager to hear about your experiences during the war." Klaus followed him to a classroom where 30 engineering students sat waiting, their notebooks open, their faces showing the kind of confidence that came from growing up in a rebuilt, successful nation. They had no memory of defeat, no understanding of what it felt like to watch your certainties crumble under the weight of superior systems. He began his lecture not with grand pronouncements but with a story. He told them about a cold December in Belgium, about capturing an American Jeep, about spending weeks studying its crude, simple design. He described his initial dismissiveness, then his growing understanding, then his final recognition of what the vehicle represented. "The Jeep taught me that elegance in engineering is not the same as effectiveness in application," Klaus said. "We Germans had always believed that superior quality would triumph over inferior quantity. The Americans taught us that adequate quality in overwhelming quantity creates its own form of superiority." He paused, looking at the young faces. "This is not a lesson about accepting mediocrity. It's a lesson about understanding context. What wins in peacetime competition may lose in wartime production. What impresses engineers may fail soldiers." He pulled out a photograph, one of the few items he'd kept from the war. It showed the Jeep sitting in his Belgian barn, surrounded by disassembled components, his chart of comparisons visible on the wall behind it. This vehicle defeated Germany more surely than any tank or bomber. It represented a philosophy we couldn't match because we didn't understand it in time. By the time we learned the lesson, the war was over. The students asked questions about technical details, about specific design choices, about how modern German manufacturing had integrated these lessons. Klaus answered patiently, but his final words were about humility rather than technique. "Engineering is not just about building things correctly," he concluded. "It's about building the right things for the circumstances you face. Sometimes the crude solution is the right solution. Sometimes good enough is better than perfect. The Jeep taught me that, and I've spent 50 years making sure Germany learned it too. Remember that when you design your own machines, ask not just how well it works, but whether it's the right answer to the actual question being asked."